Four voices on Brexit and the UK media. On the Leave side, a former political editor at both the Sunday Times and the Daily Mail, papers that want the UK out of the EU.
As an island, we've never been fully part of the European project.
On the Remain side, a journalist campaigning for a more reasoned debate on issues pertaining to the EU.
The British media system has failed.
And two academics. One studies journalism for the Reuters Institute.
Much of the newspaper industry historically has been very skeptical of Europe.
The other teaches journalism and advocates for the reform of the British media.
The right-wing press have a lot of responsibility to bear.
One of the curious things about this story is just how unsurprising it was, the political development and the coverage. Prime Minister Theresa May's blueprint for Britain's exodus from the EU, the terms under which the UK would depart, did not even have the support of her own party.
At what point it was decided that Brexit means remain?
Let alone the opposition parties. Had EU officials somehow agreed to the British Prime Minister's proposal, that would have been real news. But they didn't. About the only people surprised by that, or who feigned surprise with a little outrage thrown in, were Britain's pro-Brexit tabloid press.
What a great headline that was. Yes, this language is emotive, but this is a tabloid paper. It is a red-blooded tabloid designed for red-blooded readers who have strong views on where we are going with the Brexit negotiation. I think Sun readers look for that full throttle coverage. The Sun is not a newspaper that is on the one hand, on the other. The Sun is a newspaper that takes its position and goes for it.
To see that such an important, fragile, delicate moment can be used by the media to whip up really what is essentially hate was extremely dangerous. Today, in the current situation in which we have a country profoundly divided, to use that kind of rhetoric is completely irresponsible.
The sort of language that talks about two-bit mobsters of the European Union reflects a discourse that's been going on around coverage of the EU for the last 2 decades. It's always been about the contest between the UK and the EU rather than a more collaborative relationship. So that's been based on a lot of conflictual understandings and sometimes downright lies, but it fits a discourse around this idea of the EU being a very bullying and nannying construct that is taking away powers from the UK.
But who is really bullying whom? The European Union takes issue with the kind of coverage it gets in many of its member states. Brussels has become kind of a journalistic shorthand for a political body many European media outlets depict as remote, out of touch, and overly bureaucratic. Which is why this past week, when the EU's Justice Commissioner spoke of news outlets that are divisive, exclusionary, and dealing in misinformation, she made it clear she wasn't just talking about the media in the UK.
Almost daily, we could find examples of stories.
What she did say was that the British press has produced some of the most divisive EU coverage.
Sadly, I don't think that would have any kind of effect in Britain, because it seems that anything that comes from Europe at the moment is mostly distorted and turned on its head. This is a consequence of the transformation of the media, because there is no incentive, especially in a landscape which is extremely competitive, in being the ones who foster dialogue and harmony. Dialogue and harmony doesn't pile up clicks on the net.
Well, I don't think anyone in the British media is going to take lessons from anyone in Brussels over the rhetoric and the kind of demeanour of the debate. It's hardly as if the EU and its officials are entirely guilt-free in this dialogue. Clearly, we don't want it to become more hateful or hate-filled. But it's not a problem for it to be colourful, for it to be passionate, because you know what? People are really fired up about this.
Which begs the following questions. If the British really are that fired up about the EU and Brexit, how did they get that way? And are the newspapers, the tabloids in particular, reporting on the public mood, or are they producing it? The referendum result in 2016 was close, 52% in favor of leaving to 48%. At the time, pro-leave papers were far more numerous and more widely read. 73% of the newspapers sold in the UK favoured Brexit. Only 27% of the papers sold opposed it. The country was evenly split. The newspapers were not, reflecting the views of their owners, who are mostly conservative, as opposed to their readers. Media analysts describe those papers as Eurosceptical. What they really are is Euro-hostile, a term that also applies to Boris Johnson, a politician who has seen the EU story from both sides. The Conservative MP and former cabinet minister campaigned hard for Brexit, making dubious claims to journalists about simple solutions that have since proven untrue.
Why are we sending £10 billion a year net to Brussels, some of which is spent on Spanish bullfighting?
Johnson used to be a journalist, although not a very good one. In the late 1980s, he was fired by the Times of London for making up quotes, then hired by the Daily Telegraph and assigned to Brussels to cover the EU. It was there that Johnson honed his anti-EU messaging, developing a style of coverage that was later emulated by other British journalists.
Boris Johnson did not invent the current form of coverage of the European Union that we see in the British media, but he is a good symbol of it in the way that as a journalist he had a keen eye for the sort of quite engaging, often funny and occasionally misleading or outright false story about seemingly quirky forms of European legislation or regulation around food, curved bananas and the like. But it's only partly about the media. It's also very much about politics. And of course, Boris Johnson made the journey from being a journalist to being a commentator and to being now a very prominent conservative politician.
And he was very well known for not showing up at the press conferences and then going to the office and making it up whatever he thought was funny or hilarious to ridicule the EU. Someone who has been responsible for that kind of disinformation, lies and irresponsible journalism then ended up to benefit from it politically.
The pro-Brexit press in the UK does not limit its antagonism to the EU. 2 years ago, when a British court ruled that Parliament had the constitutional right to have the last say on Brexit, the Daily Mail declared the judges involved enemies of the people and reported that one of them was openly gay. The Daily Mail is one of the country's biggest selling newspapers. It's a good deal more popular than it is trustworthy, which is not as contradictory as it may appear.
Popularity and trust is not the same thing. And this is really clear when you look at the trust scores of individual tabloid brands. Lots of people really like the Daily Mail or really like The Sun for lots of reasons. They find it funny, they find it something that sort of gets their blood pressure up, but it's not necessarily something they consider a particularly trustworthy source of information.
Trust in all news organisations is dropping. It's dropping most for the tabloid press, that's true. People no longer know who to trust. And it's largely to do with media elites and political elites. And the entanglement of power between media elites and political elites makes them even more distrusted, because people know that they work together and that that's where power resides.